residents of Kitimat, BC say LNG Canada's operations are already leaving them exhausted and worried for their health, as the Narwhal reported recently, and that there are already increased reports of respiratory problems linked to flaring as a plume of black smoke rises from LNG Canada. As of June 2025, fewer than 1 in 5 Canadians want their tax dollars going to largely foreign-owned companies to build more LNG projects. LNG Canada is actually a foreign-owned joint venture of Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi Corporation, and Korea Gas. Meanwhile, other LNG projects are also backed by U.S. interests tied to the current U.S. administration. In BC, the Ksi Lisims LNG project is being incorrectly referred to by the Premier as Indigenous-owned, when the entity that will construct, own, and operate the assets of the project is a wholly owned subsidiary of Texas-based Western LNG, funded by U.S. private equity firms with ties to the U.S. administration. Even Shell's CEO has warned of LNG oversupply as developers continue to approve additional projects, and Shell's CEO admitted it's not economically fully rational. Sponsors of around 70% of LNG export projects currently under construction would struggle to recover their invested capital. Exporting LNG will likely raise the cost of gas in Canada, and BC households are going to experience much higher gas bills because BC has started exporting LNG, because they'll be paying global gas prices. This is despite, again, the fact that 77% of British Columbians favor renewable energy and clean energy projects instead of LNG. In Australia, wholesale gas prices tripled as a result of this factor, and US households were paying 50% more for the gas as LNG exports began. But all of this hasn't stopped the federal and provincial governments from wasting taxpayer money on dead-end LNG projects. LNG Canada received a precedent-setting incentive package, a policy framework for the BC government that includes corporate tax breaks, reduced rates for electricity consumption, and interest-free deferral of provincial sales tax on construction, each valued at tens of millions of dollars every year. It also received $275 million in direct federal subsidies, and a federal exemption on steel tariffs, which cost taxpayers as much as $1 billion. Canada is spending 3 times more back in oil and gas than renewables, even though renewables are a better investment. Many First Nations have spoken out against fracking and LNG development because infrastructure for these massive industrial projects, such as pipelines, crosses their territories. For example, the Wet'suwet'en never gave consent for the Coastal GasLink pipeline that was built to supply that LNG terminal in Kitimat, and several First Nations have not given consent to the Prince Rupert gas transmission that would supply the Ksi Lisims LNG project also in northern BC. Liquefied natural gas is unlikely to replace coal overseas. Analysts confirm that renewable energy, not LNG, is the biggest competitor to coal in both China and India. Indeed, LNG can emit as much greenhouse gas as coal. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast. I'm your host Connor Curtis, and as you might have seen in breaking news, Mark Carney is due to announce another set of quote-unquote nation-building projects. As CBC News reported yesterday, November 11th, the federal government announced the first tranche in September, and being on the list is meant to help spur private investment and clear red tape for projects facing regulatory hurdles. Among the projects likely to be included in this new list of projects is the Ksi Lisims liquefied natural gas, or LNG project in British Columbia. And so we thought it would be good to go over why these LNG projects proposed in Canada are not nation-building projects, in a number of different ways, including their connections to the US administration, their unpopularity relative to renewable energy, and the fact that they are economically irrelevant. And after talking about all of those reasons, we're going to chat about the negative health outcomes locally, like the fact that residents of Kitimat, BC say LNG Canada's operations are already leaving them exhausted and worried for their health, as the Narwhal reported recently, and that there are already increased reports of respiratory problems linked to flaring as a plume of black smoke rises from LNG Canada. And we're going to go over the climate impact of these projects, since it must be noted that the federal government is choosing to back an unnecessary LNG project, that's liquefied natural gas project, even as COP30 happens in Brazil. So, for this special episode, Here's why LNG projects are not nation-building, and why renewables are best for jobs, health, and the economy. As of June 2025, fewer than 1 in 5 Canadians want their tax dollars going to largely foreign-owned companies to build more LNG projects, and 72% of Albertans wish to maintain or increase federal climate action and action to transition the country to clean energy. In March, polling showed 65% of Canadians want renewables instead of oil and gas development, and polling in June confirms 67% now prefer renewables and clean energy generally to oil and gas development. It's 77% in BC. LNG Canada is actually a foreign-owned joint venture of Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi Corporation, and Korea Gas. Meanwhile, other LNG projects are also backed by U.S. interests tied to the current U.S. administration. In BC, the Ksi Lisims LNG project is being incorrectly referred to by the Premier as Indigenous-owned, when the entity that will construct, own, and operate the assets of the project is a wholly owned subsidiary of Texas-based Western LNG, funded by U.S. private equity firms with ties to the U.S. administration. LNG is not a good solution for the Canadian economy and risks Canadians' health and our climate future. It's also not a good solution for local economies in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Atlantic Canada, and new gas plants are not needed locally either. So here's specifically why LNG is not a good plan for jobs or local economies. Global demand for oil and gas is set to peak this decade and then decline, and there are enough projects already underway to meet that demand. The policies and resulting impact of the current US administration will not change this fact. Plastics alone would never sustain the oil and gas industry in terms of anything close to current demand. Claims that gas demand will expand ignore the most recent research from the authoritative voice on energy, the International Energy Agency. Forecasts that predict a shallow decline in oil and gas demand are based on unrealistic scenarios, and even a shallow decline spells trouble for global markets, as even a shallow decline can dump prices. Even Shell's CEO has warned of LNG oversupply as developers continue to approve additional projects, and Shell's CEO admitted it's not economically fully rational. Artificial intelligence is also not expected to change the case for LNG demand. As one energy analyst put it, we don't anticipate Germany needing gas for AI specifically, especially since heavier reliance on gas would just ramp up electricity prices and push these data centers away even more. As a result of the coming decline in demand, global oil and gas corporate exploration budgets are already shrinking, and oil and gas investment is shifting to short-term gains. Demand for liquefied natural gas, or LNG, in emerging markets is contingent on price, and LNG is expensive to produce in Canada. LNG is a risky bet as renewables are rapidly becoming the default for energy development, especially across the global south. Low-cost renewable energy is soaring in China and Vietnam. Vietnam's wind and solar generation exceeds gas-fired power generation. Demand is estimated to have already peaked in Europe and South Korea. China has already surpassed its 2030 renewable energy ambitions. In fact, China installed more wind and solar power in a single year than the total amount of renewable energy currently operating in the United States. Canada actually risks losing out on the renewable future of energy and ending up reliant on China if we don't build our own independent renewable energy supply chains. And the International Energy Agency, again, the authoritative voice on energy, says in its World Energy Outlook for 2024 that it anticipates a surplus of LNG supply in coming years, and that we estimate that the sponsors of around 70% of LNG export projects currently under construction would struggle to recover their invested capital. Exporting LNG will likely raise the cost of gas in Canada, and BC households are going to experience much higher gas bills because BC has started exporting LNG, because they'll be paying global gas prices. This is despite, again, the fact that 77% of British Columbians favor renewable energy and clean energy products instead of LNG. In Australia, wholesale gas prices tripled as a result of this factor, and US households were paying 50% more for the gas as LNG exports began. By contrast, 81% of renewables offer cheaper energy than fossil fuels. Renewables also create far more jobs than oil and gas projects. It's easier to localize renewable jobs in communities in places like Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador where they are desperately needed, and northern BC. And renewables are more reliable than oil and gas. But all of this hasn't stopped the federal and provincial governments from wasting taxpayer money on dead-end LNG projects. LNG Canada received a precedent-setting incentive package, a policy framework from the BC government That includes corporate tax breaks, reduced rates for electricity consumption, and interest-free deferral of provincial sales tax on construction, each valued at tens of millions of dollars every year. It also received $275 million in direct federal subsidies, and a federal exemption on steel tariffs, which cost taxpayers as much as $1 billion. Canada is spending 3 times more back in oil and gas than renewables, even though renewables are a better investment. The Nova Scotia provincial government has also attempted to implement a series of US-style authoritarian measures in favor of fracking for gas, and lifted a ban on fracking without consulting the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs. It was a protection adopted after consultation and engagement with Nova Scotians and backed by health and economic research. The idea that we need new gas plants to enable renewable energy is also false. We already have energy storage options for renewable energy that are cheaper than building out new gas plants. Solar and wind with battery storage are said to produce cheaper electricity than natural gas in Alberta and Ontario. Many First Nations have spoken out against fracking and LNG development because infrastructure for these massive industrial projects such as pipelines crosses their territories. For example, the Wet'suwet'en never gave consent for the Coastal GasLink pipeline that was built to supply that LNG terminal in Kitimat, and several First Nations have not given consent to the Prince Rupert gas transmission that would supply the Ksi Lisims LNG project also in northern BC. LNG interests, as with all fossil fuel interests, now rely heavily on maintaining the false appearance that there will be continued oil and gas expansion, an appearance propped up by Canadian taxpayer support. Because if people see the evidence beyond the spin, investors will quickly realize reserves of oil and gas are overvalued. A key energy journalist wrote recently, every fossil fuel company everywhere wants investors, governments, and citizens to think, even against the thinnest of evidence, it will be the last one standing as its business case steadily crashes. But times are already tough, and the tell comes from 2 of the industry's biggest voices. The problem is that citizens, rather than fossil companies, and their shareholders might be stuck picking up the tab. In short, if Canada does not go renewable soon, we risk being left behind to carry the weight of a lot of very unpopular and uneconomical gas projects. Because renewables create more jobs and localized jobs while helping to protect the climate, it's also best to power any data centers with renewables, not gas. We already have renewable solutions for when the sun does not shine or wind does not blow, like interconnected grids, energy efficiency, and energy storage. But LNG prices are inherently volatile due to international factors beyond our control. And LNG harms our health. Already, as I mentioned, LNG exports are having negative health outcomes locally, with residents near LNG infrastructure reporting disturbing impacts. As Business in Vancouver reported, startup emissions at BC LNG plants are systemically underestimated, and some of the symptoms people are noticing in the area include nosebleeds, coughs, people having severe allergies. People are not sure what they're breathing in and not getting any answers about it. They're reporting things like a big black cloud of smoke, worsening symptoms, and increased reports of respiratory problems linked to flaring. And they're asking questions like, what is this going to look like in decades from now? And are things like incidence of cancer going to go through the roof? Again, there's some great reporting on this, not just from Business in Vancouver, but also from the Narwhal that you'll find on our resources page, which is going to be linked in the description. We have an overburdened healthcare system, but the federal government is handing over hundreds of millions of public dollars to the largely foreign-owned LNG projects that harm Canadians' health. Pollution from gas extraction at the point of extraction particularly affects the health of Albertans. For Albertans, the odds of having negative respiratory and cardiovascular health outcomes increases by 9 to 21%, depending on the number of oil and gas wells a person lives near, CBC News reported in January of 2025. LNG is also often produced through fracking to extract gas from deep beneath the ground. Fracking is extremely water intensive and requires massive amounts of toxic chemicals, many of which cause cancer, and recent studies have shown strong correlations between proximity to fracking sites and increased rates of preterm births, low birth weight, childhood asthma, and leukemia. And that statement comes from Nova Scotia doctors who are warning about the health risks of fracking. Doctors are also warning that BC's fracking and LNG export industry is linked with serious health harms, including cancer, respiratory disease, abnormal pregnancy outcomes, and premature death. Worsening human health puts pressure on an already struggling healthcare system and increases healthcare costs for everyone. Gas appliances, further down the line, create indoor air pollution, which has been linked to asthma, particularly in kids. The chemicals that are used in fracking in particular are also injected deep underground with such force it can cause earthquakes. Quebec, New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador, Germany, France, Spain, the UK, and Italy, among others, have banned or put moratoriums on fracking because of health and environmental impacts. And, finally, LNG harms our climate. We are experiencing some of the worst ever fire seasons in Canada, yet our governments are planning to make the climate crisis worse. Liquefied natural gas is unlikely to replace coal overseas. Analysts confirm that renewable energy, not LNG, is the biggest competitor to coal in both China and India. Solutions are also being found to replace coal in industrial processes. There is a significant shift away from coal happening as most steelmaking is now electric. Methane is the main component of liquefied natural gas, and it's 80 times more powerful at warming the climate than carbon pollution. Indeed, LNG can emit as much greenhouse gas as coal. LNG Canada will release 4 megatons of CO2, carbon dioxide equivalent, per year for at least 25 years. This is equivalent to adding 1 million vehicles to Canadian streets every year for 25 years. Based on LNG emission estimates, at least 38 megatons of CO2 per year will be released if all of the exported gas is burned. Fossil fuels, including fracked British Columbian gas, are among the biggest drivers of climate change. Fossil fuels account for over 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and nearly 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions. Fossil fuel production and burning are drivers of climate-related events such as wildfires and heat waves and severe storms. 13 Canadian oil and gas companies, including 5 of the 6 that make up the Pathways Alliance oil sands lobby group, are on the list of 88 big carbon polluters called out for a major share of deforested lands lost to wildfires in North America between 1989 and 2021. With climate change, BC is experiencing unprecedented droughts and other impacts. Expanding LNG will require massive amounts of water, competing with needs including hydro, agriculture, and fighting fires. Canada has very high per capita emissions relative to other countries and historical emissions, but our country's failure to meet emissions targets is not individuals' fault. This failure is the fault of large oil and gas corporations which fail to act. We can't ask people in other countries with much lower per capita emissions to act on climate change if we don't act now to go renewable here in Canada, as they already are doing. Workers are not to blame, but executives and lobbyists at the top of oil and gas companies are definitely to blame. Being dependent upon oil and gas does not mean you can't call for systemic changes to end that dependence and hold oil and gas corporations responsible for decades of lies that made things much worse. Just because we are dependent on oil and gas and fossil fuels now to an extent does not mean we should proceed with new developments and new LNG projects that make no sense for Canada or for the well-being of our health or the environment. You can find sources for everything I've said here in the link in the description of this podcast. And finally, just a reminder that we also have a current Take Action item that you can sign that is around greenwashing, and it is calling on the government to reinforce, not weaken, as it plans to do, anti-greenwashing laws in Canada, the sort of laws that prevent companies from lying about the health and environmental impacts of their projects. And so if you would like to take action related to this subject, please take a second. The link will be in the description of the podcast to send a message to the federal government to call for stronger greenwashing regulations. Thank you. We will also have more actions to come related to this and other issues, so stay tuned. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca, where you have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up from the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.